In 1949, a finished three-bedroom ranch house on Long Island, kitchen wired, appliances installed, key in hand, sold for $7,990, $58 a month. Nothing down for veterans. A washing machine and a television came with it. No extra charge. On a single day in March of that year, more than 1,000 couples who had been camped in line for up to 4 days signed 1,400 contracts for houses that did not yet exist. That same house on that same street sells today for something close to $750,000, and more than 8 million people now live on the island where it stands. The dollar figures read like a story about real estate. They are not. They are the last entry in a ledger that opened 3 centuries earlier, with a fortune that swam past the island rather than growing on it, and every fortune the island produced, after that, one replaced the fortune before it, so completely that almost nobody living there today could name the one that started it. Chapter 1. The First Footholds. On June 12, 1640, 8 men, 1 woman, and a boy, sailing out of Lynn, Massachusetts, came ashore on the eastern end of Long Island at a gravel landing that would later be named Conscience Point. They had no fort waiting for them. They had no royal charter guaranteeing the ground under their feet. They had no plan beyond the conviction that Massachusetts, after barely a decade of English settlement, was already too crowded to hold them. What they founded that day, Southampton, is counted among the first 2 English towns in what would become the state of New York. Southold, 40 miles east on the North Fork, has spent nearly 4 centuries disputing which of the 2 came first, and the argument has never been resolved. The Shinnecock were already living on that ground, and it was their instruction, not English experience, that carried the newcomers through the first years. They showed the settlers where the sandy soil would hold a corn crop and how to fertilize a furrow with alewives and menhaden, a technique coastal peoples along this shore had practiced for generations before any Englishman had reason to cross an ocean. Southampton's first harvests were a Shinnecock harvest, taught rather than invented, and the town's survival depended on it. 18 years later, in 1658, colonists opened pasture at the far end of the island, on the bluffs above what is now Montauk, and gave it a name that has outlasted nearly every other institution founded in that first generation, Deep Hollow Ranch. It is still in business. It is the oldest working cattle ranch in the United States, in continuous operation since before there was a United States to operate in, predating the cattle drives of Texas by roughly 2 centuries. At its peak, Deep Hollow ran as many as 6,000 head of cattle across grazing land that faced open Atlantic on 3 sides. Livestock, driven and grazed, on an island most Americans today associate with beach traffic and hedge funds, not cattle. By Act of Congress, on July 31, 1789, Sag Harbor was designated an official port of entry of the United States, 1 day ahead of New York City, which received the identical designation from the identical Congress. It was not a symbolic distinction. In that first year on the customs books, Sag Harbor cleared more square-rigged tonnage than the Port of New York itself, a fact that reads today like a printing error and was, in 1789, simply the shipping report. 2 decades later, in 1810, the village doing that business counted perhaps 850 residents. A customs house keeping a nation's shipping ledger out of a hamlet smaller than a few blocks of houses. Around 1815, oystermen began laying cultivated beds in the Great South Bay, off a spit of land called Blue Point, working a native species that had grown wild in those waters for centuries. Within 2 generations, the name had stopped meaning a place and started meaning a standard. By the 1850s, the Blue Point oyster was the only oyster served at Buckingham Palace, carried across an ocean to a table that could have ordered any shellfish on the planet and ordered this one instead. None of it. The corn taught by the Shinnecock, the cattle at Deep Hollow, the customs stamp at Sag Harbor, the oyster beds at Blue Point, was the fortune that first made this stretch of coastline rich. The real fortune never walked ashore, and it never took root in the sand. It swam past the beach in pods that farmers could watch breaching from their own front fields, a few hundred yards out season after season, worth more per animal than anything Deep Hollow would ever put out to pasture. It would take a little over a century for anyone on the island to work out exactly what that was worth, and considerably less time than that to spend it. EMA Chapter 2: The Whaling Empire. By 1845, Sag Harbor was sending more than 60 whaling ships out to sea in a single season. Not the largest whaling port in America, that distinction belonged to New Bedford, but the largest in the state of New York, bigger than Cold Spring Harbor, well ahead of Greenport, without a rival anywhere between the Battery and Montauk Point. The American whaling fleet as a whole peaked at 735 vessels the following year in 1846, which means that in the mid-1840s, roughly one ship in every 12 chasing whales anywhere on Earth under an American flag sailed out of this one harbor on the eastern end of Long Island. The very next year, in 1847, Sag Harbor delivered a season no merchant there would see repeated: 3,910 barrels of sperm oil, 63,712 barrels of whale oil, 605,340 pounds of whalebone, all of it rendered from animals killed a year or more earlier on the far side of an ocean, all of it arriving at the same modest waterfront within the same 12 months. The harbor smelled of it for weeks. The counting houses smelled of it longer. Cold Spring Harbor worked its own fleet across the same decades. 9 ships, among them the Monmouth, the Tuscarora, the Splendid, the Sheffield. A Tuscarora voyage ran 22 months, a Splendid voyage more than 3 years. None of it paid a wage. Whalemen worked for a lay, a fixed share of the profit, an ordinary hand near 1/200th, a captain near 1/15th, in a fleet where roughly 3 in 10 hands were men of color. Cooperatives turned out the barrels. Other shops cut whalebone into stays and springs. The money reached men who had not yet become who they would be. In 1819, a young investor named James Fenimore Cooper bought the majority share of the Sag Harbor Whaler Union. Before he had published a single novel, before the name Cooper meant anything to American readers, the voyage lost money. Within a year, he had turned to writing instead, and the trade that failed him at sea became, before long, one of the most successful literary careers in the country. Enter Mercator Cooper, no relation, a Sag Harbor-born ship's captain who had spent 2 decades working whalers out of the same docks before he took the Manhattan to sea in November 1843. What happened on that voyage had nothing to do with whales. In the spring of 1845, after his crew pulled 22 shipwrecked Japanese sailors from the Pacific, and Cooper chose to sail them home rather than land them at the nearest port, the Manhattan became the first American ship permitted into Tokyo Bay, 8 years before Commodore Matthew Perry made the same crossing under orders from Washington. Cooper's crew came home with more than an empty hold. They came home with a chart of the bay's approaches, the same chart, by local record, that found its way into Perry's hands before his own squadron ever sighted Japan in 1853. At the helm of the Manhattan that spring stood Pyrrhus Conser, born enslaved in Southampton in 1814, guiding an American ship into the one harbor on Earth no American ship had ever been allowed to enter. He lived to be 83, dying in 1897, and the town that had once counted him as property buried him under a stone whose words were supplied by Elihu Root. Though born a slave, he possessed those virtues, without which kings are but slaves. The ship that carried him to Tokyo Bay shared its name, by coincidence, with the island city 70 miles to the west, a city that in 1845 was lighting its street lamps, its parlors, and its counting houses on the same whale oil Sag Harbor was shipping past its door. None of the men on that voyage, and none of the merchants counting barrels back on Long Island, had any reason yet to look toward Pennsylvania. Nothing had been drilled there. Nothing had even been named. But something was already collecting, quietly, in the rock, under a stretch of forest near a town called Titusville. a light that would need no harpoon, no tripod, and no 3 years at sea to produce, and that would make every barrel Sag Harbor had ever counted worthless within a single generation. Chapter 3. The Whale Light Goes Out. In 1846, the American whaling fleet reached its full size, 735 vessels, working every ocean that held a sperm whale worth the chase. 3 years later, in 1849, the fleet did not need a storm or a war to come apart. It needed a river in California with gold sitting loose in the gravel. Sag Harbor ships docked in San Francisco Bay that year to resupply before the long haul home, and their crews walked off the wharves and did not come back. It was gold that pulled men off the decks before their contracts were finished. A decade later, oil pulled customers out of the whale oil market entirely. Not long after, gas took the last lamps of Sag Harbor itself away from the very product the town had spent 2 centuries selling. 3 forces, roughly 10 years apart, and every one of them landed on the same industry. The ships left behind in San Francisco Bay were not lost at sea. They were simply abandoned at anchor, riding empty in the harbor, while the men who had sailed them dug creek beds 20 miles inland. The lay system that had paid them for 2 centuries explains how easily that trade was made. A whaleman sailed for a thin fraction of a voyage's eventual profit, and a man panning gravel answered to no captain's share. Some sat long enough that their hulls rotted where they floated, masts still rigged, holds still fitted for oil nobody was left aboard to render. A whaling voyage ran 3 years and risked a man's life for a payday that gold now offered in a single season, with no ocean crossing required to collect it. 10 years later, in 1859, oil began coming out of the ground at Titusville, Pennsylvania. A fuel that needed no 3-year voyage, no dead animal, no rendering pot to make light. It came out of the ground close to burning already, and it did not care whether the season's catch had been good. The arithmetic that had run Sag Harbor's economy for 2 generations simply stopped holding. The town did not lose a war with petroleum. It lost a comparison. The irony arrived inside the same year. In December of 1859, Sag Harbor became the first village east of Brooklyn to light its own streets with gas. The town that had spent 2 centuries selling the world its light switching off its own supply before most of its neighbors had switched theirs on. The last whaling ship to leave Sag Harbor's dock, the Myra, sailed in 1871, the last. No ship went out after her. The dying was not finished with the industry. On December 30th, 1876, the merchant ship Circassian broke apart 400 yards off the beach at Bridgehampton, the width of a few village blocks from dry land. 28 of the 32 men aboard died in the surf, and among them were all 10 Shinnecock whalemen who had come out to strip her cargo before the hull gave way. Men the salvage company had kept aboard to finish the work rather than put ashore. It was not an unusual crew. For 2 generations, no whaler left Sag Harbor's dock without 1 Shinnecock hand aboard. 9 women in one small community became widows that night. 25 children became orphans. A tribe that had manned Long Island's whaleboats for 2 centuries lost 10 of its working men in a single evening. 3 years after that, in 1879, a developer named Arthur Benson bought roughly 10,000 acres of Montauk for $151,000, land the Montaukett had lived on since before Southampton existed. In 1910, a New York judge ruled the tribe legally extinct. The Montaukett are still fighting, in court and out of it, for the recognition that ruling took from them. By the time that ruling came down, the money that had once moved through Sag Harbor's counting houses had already found somewhere else to go. It was not chasing whales, and it was not settling Montauk. It had crossed to the island's other shore, where the newest fortunes of the Gilded Age were already clearing woodland for houses larger than any building a Sag Harbor whaling merchant had ever put his name on. Chapter 4. The Gold Coast. Between the 1890s and 1930, the new fortunes of American industry built somewhere between 500 and 1,200 mansions along the north shore of Long Island. The range itself is the point. By every account, no one ever finished counting. There were French chateaux built without a French family behind them. There were English manors built without an English line to inherit them. There were Italian villas built without an Italian coastline to explain them. What the North Shore had instead was money moving fast enough to buy any history it wanted, reassembled stone by stone, on land that had been potato fields within living memory. Otto Kahn was a Mannheim-born banker who had risen to a partnership at Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Between 1914 and 1919, he spent $11 million on 127 rooms across 109,000 square feet on 443 acres at Cold Spring Hills, the second largest private house in the country, after only the Biltmore. The land had no hill in the right place, so Kahn's crews spent 2 years building one, moving earth until the house stood exactly where he wanted it. Running the estate took 126 servants and 39 fireplaces, all of it built fireproof, since the first Oheka had already burned to the ground once. Frank Woolworth needed no artificial hill for Winfield Hall in Glen Cove. 56 rooms were enough, set off by a marble staircase that cost $2 million by itself. The dime store king had built the fortune behind it nickel and dime at a time, one counter transaction after another for decades before he ever climbed those particular stairs. None of it matched, in scale, what Theodore Roosevelt had built 3 decades earlier, for considerably less. Sagamore Hill in Oyster Bay ran to 22 rooms and cost $16,975 in 1885, built by a young politician still minding a budget. History repaid the restraint. Between 1902 and 1908, cabinet officers and foreign dignitaries rerouted enough business to Oyster Bay that reporters started calling the house the Summer White House, a modest building doing the diplomatic work of an estate many times its price. On September 6, 1924, Clarence Mackay turned his own estate, Harbor Hill, into the grandest party the North Shore had staged to that date. The Prince of Wales came as guest of honor among 1,200 others, and Mackay's staff had strung thousands of blue electric lamps through the trees and along the drive to manufacture the moonlight. The actual moon was not providing that night. Paul Whiteman's orchestra played until the small hours, for a lawn holding 1,200 of the richest people in America. Near where that party was being planned, F. Scott Fitzgerald was renting a house in Great Neck, where he lived from October 1922 to April 1924, and wrote the opening chapters of a novel in a room above the garage. He put the new money on his own side of the bay and called it West Egg at an address modeled on Kings Point. He put the old money across the water and called it East Egg at an address modeled on Sands Point. The manuscript would be finished elsewhere, but its central geography. New fortune and old fortune, facing each other across a few hundred yards of water, each certain the other had gotten it wrong. Fitzgerald had already found, because he was living inside it. The same money had already found a use for the roads between these houses. On October 8, 1904, the first Vanderbilt Cup ran the country's first major international motor race over 30 miles of Nassau County dirt, and William K. Vanderbilt II liked the result enough to build something permanent for it. Starting in 1908, his Long Island Motor Parkway ran 45 miles of poured concrete for a $2 toll, the first road in America built for the automobile alone. Years before most of the country agreed, the automobile was worth a road of its own. The engines racing on that concrete would not stay on the ground for long. Within a year of the parkway's opening, men were already gathering on the flat grassland just north of it, teaching a different kind of machine to leave the road behind entirely. Chapter 5. The Cradle of Aviation. On September 23, 1911, a pilot named Earl Ovington lifted off from the Hempstead Plains with a canvas mailbag balanced across his knees, 640 letters and 1,280 postcards packed inside it. The first official airmail flight the United States Post Office had ever authorized. The Post Office had sanctioned the flight as an experiment, uncertain whether the air was a serious way to move the mail or a stunt dressed up as one. There was no hatch to drop the bag through and no cargo hold built to carry it. Ovington simply held it on his lap until he was over the drop point, then let it go over the side of the cockpit. It fell, and it burst on impact. And the first airmail delivery in American history arrived scattered across an open field, gathered up letter by letter, postcard by postcard, by the people who had watched it come down. 2 years earlier, on July 17, 1909, the same stretch of ground had already made its name. Glenn Curtiss took the Golden Flyer up over the Hempstead Plains that afternoon, flying 52 minutes and better than 15 miles to win the $10,000 Scientific American Trophy and the flat grassland east of Mineola, clear of the trees that could clip a wingtip, the hills that could break a glide path, the fences that could catch an undercarriage, became, within a few seasons, the patch of ground every pilot on the eastern seaboard wanted under his wheels. The same men who had poured the concrete of the Long Island Motor Parkway a year earlier for engines that were built to stay on the ground now had a reason to drive out past their own toll booths and watch a different kind of engine leave the ground entirely. The plains would come to be known, simply and without exaggeration, as the cradle of American aviation. 2 military airfields rose on that plain within a decade, and both were named for the dead. Mitchell Field carried the name of John Purroy Mitchell, New York's boy mayor, who died in 1918 during a training flight of his own. Roosevelt Field carried the name of Quentin Roosevelt, the youngest of Theodore Roosevelt's sons, shot down over France in 1918 while flying for the U.S. Air Service. Quentin had grown up 15 miles west of that runway, in the 22-room house at Sagamore Hill. The house that had once hosted cabinet officers as the summer White House now lent an airfield the name of the son it never got back. In an era when a dead official's name was the highest currency a public work could spend, both fields collected on it early. 9 years after Roosevelt Field opened, at 7:52 in the morning on May 20th, 1927, Charles Lindbergh taxied the Spirit of St. Louis down that runway carrying 450 gallons of fuel, more weight than the plane had ever been asked to lift off that ground before. The wheels barely cleared the grass. Witnesses said the plane missed the telephone wires strung at the runway's end by a matter of feet, close enough that the people watching did not exhale until the wires were behind him. 33 and a half hours and 3,610 miles later, he landed in Paris, and the $25,000 Orteig Prize belonged to him. On June 4, 1927, Clarence Chamberlain flew the monoplane Columbia off the same runway with passenger Charles Levine aboard, landing 42 hours later outside Eisleben, Germany, 295 miles past Lindbergh's distance. Levine now the first passenger in history to cross the Atlantic by air. 3 weeks later, a Fokker tri-motor named America left the same field carrying Richard Byrd as navigator, pilots Bert Acosta and Bernd Balchen, and radio operator George Neuville. Cloud over Paris turned them back toward the coast, and 2 days out they came down in the surf off Vers-sur-Mer, Normandy, 300 yards short of the beach. A flight that missed Paris and still earned Byrd the Legion of Honor. Curtiss had learned to fly on those planes, Ovington's mailbag had scattered across that same field. Lindbergh had lifted off from it toward Paris. The planes were not going to stay planes much longer. The next man to redraw Long Island would not come from the sky. He would come with a state budget, a fleet of dredges, and no interest whatsoever in flight. Already looking south, at a stretch of marsh and barrier sand nobody had yet thought worth moving. Chapter 6. The Master Builder. Robert Moses had never won an election in his life, and in 44 years of public power, from 1924 to 1968, he never would. He built his authority instead from a stack of appointed titles that no voter had approved and no governor cared to revoke. President of the Long Island State Park Commission, Chairman of the New York State Council of Parks, briefly Secretary of State, later Parks Commissioner of New York City, and Chairman of the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority besides. At his peak, he held as many as 12 of these titles simultaneously. He took the first of them, the Park Commission Chair, in 1924. Within a year, he was building a road south toward ground that had belonged until then mostly to mosquitoes. The road was the Southern State Parkway, under construction since 1925. Its first stretch opened in 1927. It fed directly into a 17-mile causeway across Open Bay, built to reach a barrier island that was, at the time, barely above the tide. When funding for the causeway ran out in the winter of 1926 and 1927, Moses borrowed $20,000 from his own mother rather than let the crews stand idle. Between 1927 and 1929, dredges pumped 40 million cubic yards of sand out of the bay floor and onto that shoreline, raising it roughly 14 feet above the surf. Pumped sand does not hold itself in place. Through the summer of 1928, thousands of laborers planted beach grass by hand across the new dunes, anchoring sand that 2 years of dredging had only just delivered. Nobody recorded how many men did the planting, or what it cost, only that the work ran an entire season, route by route, ahead of the storms that would test whether it had held. Above the bathhouses rose a water tower 188 feet tall, built in 1930 and modeled on the Campanile, beside St. Mark's in Venice. Not an ornament, but the plant supplying every fountain, restroom, and pool in the park. On August 4, 1929, Jones Beach opened in a sandstorm strong enough to scatter the folding chairs set out for the speeches. Governor Franklin Roosevelt spoke, and beside him stood his predecessor, Alfred E. Smith and Moses, a man who had never stood for any office the crowd in front of him could have voted on. 25,000 people came through the gates that first day, regardless of the weather. By the end of the following year, 1.5 million had followed them. Moses left one more signature on these roads, not argued out publicly until long after he was dead. His parkway overpasses ran lower than comparable bridges of the same years, low enough in places to clear a car, but not a standard bus. Robert Caro's 1974 biography, The Power Broker, read the clearances as deliberate, a way to keep buses carrying the city's poorer riders, many of them black, away from parks built for a different public. Kenneth Jackson and other historians read the same bridges as nothing more than concrete built to the cheapest specification the terrain allowed. Decades later, the historian Thomas Campanella measured the bridges himself and confirmed Moses's overpasses do run lower than their contemporaries. Why he built them that way, the measurements cannot say. Southern State was only the first of 4 parkways Moses laid across Nassau and Suffolk County in those same years. The Northern State, surveyed through Gold Coast estates whose owners had spent 3 decades buying distance from exactly this kind of intrusion, opened its first stretch in July 1933 and eventually ran 28 8/10 miles. At the Brady Estate, where lawyers and letters failed to move the survey line, Witnesses saw Moses climb onto the excavating machine and work the levers himself. The Wantagh State Parkway, 13 1/3 miles, reached the northern state by December 1938. The Meadowbrook, 12 1/2 miles, broke ground in 1933 and opened its first section the year after. Moses had built, in a decade, a road network on Long Island that answered to no elected body at all. Within another decade, the same parkways he had engineered to carry Sunday drivers toward a public beach would be carrying a different kind of traffic entirely. The island of roads and sand he had built was about to be rebuilt once more, this time as an island of arsenals. Chapter 7. The Arsenal. By 1939, Grumman Aircraft Engineering in Bethpage employed 700 people building airplanes for the United States Navy. A company younger than most of the roads that served it. Leroy Grumman was a Huntington-born engineer, Cornell class of 1916, who had flown as a naval aviator in the First World War and then spent a decade at the Loaning Aeronautical Engineering Corporation in Manhattan. Test pilot from 1920. Plant manager soon after, general manager by the time Loaning sold out to Keystone Aircraft in 1929. Grumman was 34 years old and, for the first time since the war, out of a job. He incorporated the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation on December 6, 1929, and opened for business on January 2, 1930, 2 days short of his own 35th birthday. Starting capital ran near $23,000, a mortgage on his own house for $16,950, plus a $6,000 loan. The first plant was a borrowed corner of the old Cox Clement factory in Baldwin, where Grumman and a handful of employees repaired Loaning seaplanes and built aluminum floats and truck bodies to keep the doors open. The Navy's first contract came within the year for floats fitted with retractable landing gear. On April 2, 1931, the Navy ordered the FF-1, Grumman's first fighter, and the first American naval fighter built with wheels that folded into the fuselage in flight. The company outgrew Baldwin, then Valley Stream, then a rented hangar in Farmingdale, before settling in 1936 on Bethpage farmland bought from the Looney, Moesch, Nader, and Kutzer's families. It never moved again. By 1943, that workforce numbered 25,500, roughly a third of them women, working riveting jigs and instrument benches in a plant that 4 years earlier had needed a fraction of that labor. Grumman built 1,988 F-4F Wildcat fighters between 1937 and 1943, and when the Navy needed more than Bethpage alone could turn out, Eastern Aircraft, a General Motors division running converted automobile plants, built another 5,837, a combined run near 7,900 aircraft. The Avenger torpedo bomber followed the same division of labor. Grumman built 2,290 before switching its own lines entirely to fighters in 1944, and Eastern Aircraft finished the remaining 7,545 at a plant in New Jersey. Bethpage built the prototype. New Jersey built the volume. Grumman built 12,275 Hellcat fighters before the war ended, finishing 600 a month at its peak. The Navy's own tally put the kill ratio near 19-1. 5,163 confirmed kills against 270 Hellcats lost in air combat across 66,530 sorties. The riveters who built them were mostly new to factory work and disproportionately female. May Nostrand, 19 years old, became the plant's first female plane captain. Martha Mistowski could set 187 flawless rivets in 10 minutes. Barbara Jane and Elizabeth Hooker, two of Grumman's own test pilots, flew finished Hellcats off the Bethpage runway themselves before the planes ever saw a carrier deck. Nearby, at Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, workers built 9,087 P-47 Thunderbolts across the same years. By war's end, more than 75,000 people worked in Long Island's aviation plants, farmers' sons, Gold Coast chauffeurs, women who had never held a factory job before, building the machines that helped end the war at a rate no whaling merchant or railroad baron on the island had ever matched. The war would end within 2 years of that peak. When it did, the men who had built Hellcat wings and the women who had riveted Thunderbolt fuselages would go home again, along with millions of other veterans nationwide who wanted exactly one thing no aircraft plant on the island had ever produced: a house of their own and somewhere to put it. Long Island had that too, not on the Gold Coast, not at Roosevelt Field, in the potato fields of Nassau County, waiting for the war to end. Chapter 8: The Potato Field Assembly Line. On July 1, 1947, Levitt and Sons broke ground on 7.3 square miles of Nassau County potato fields that had grown nothing more valuable than potatoes for as long as anyone in the county could remember. And by 1951, 17,447 houses stood on that same ground. No developer in the country had built at that scale before. No developer had needed to. The demand waiting on the other side of the war was not a market in any ordinary sense. It was a backlog, millions of veterans deep, and Levitt and Sons had worked out how to meet it. William Levitt was a Brooklyn-born real estate operator who had spent the war years with the Navy Seabees, building airfields and barracks against military deadlines in the Pacific. And he came home with a lesson about repetition the war had taught him for free. His father, Abraham, had run a modest construction company on Long Island since the 1920s. His brother Alfred drew the houses. What William brought back was the method. He arrived in Nassau County in 1947 with that method, his family's firm, and 7.3 square miles of ground that had never held anything larger than a farmhouse. The method inverted the one Henry Ford had made, famous a generation earlier. Ford had moved the product past stationary men, each one bolted to a single station on a line built to carry the car to him. A house cannot be carried anywhere. It has to stay where its foundation is poured. So Levitt moved the men instead. 27 crews worked the site, each assigned a single trade and a single task, rehearsed until a man could pour a slab or frame a wall, or hang a door, without needing to think about which house he was standing in front of, and then walk off that lot to the identical lot next door and do it again. The pace that method produced had no precedent in American housing. A finished house came off that line roughly every 15 to 16 minutes of a working day, 30 houses a day, each one wired, plumbed, painted, and stocked with a Bendix washing machine and an Admiral television set before a family ever turned the key. The price of that first ranch has already been told. What matters here is the arithmetic behind it. Standardize the house, standardize the crew, and the cost of building one comes down at the rate of building 100,000. But the standardization did not stop at lumber and shingle. The paperwork every buyer signed carried its own printed instruction. Clause 25 of the standard Levittown lease, set in capital letters in the original document. No dwelling shall be used or occupied by members of other than the Caucasian race, but the employment and maintenance of other than Caucasian domestic servants shall be permitted. The clause was not a Levitt invention. The Federal Housing Administration, whose underwriting made the low mortgages possible in the first place, had itself recommended covenants of exactly this kind as sound lending practice for over a decade. The Supreme Court had already ruled in Shelley v. Kramer in 1948 that no court in the country could enforce such a clause. Levittown kept printing it anyway, lease after lease, buyer after buyer, for 20 more years, until the Fair Housing Act of 1968 finally made it illegal to print at all. Levitt had an answer ready whenever a reporter raised the subject. The same answer every time. No man who owns his own house and lot can be a communist, he was fond of saying. He has too much to do. It was a line built for a newspaper quote, and it worked as one. It explained the veteran holding the mortgage, he spoints sam darren in our nowordits, and it said nothing at all about the veteran the mortgage was never written for. By 1951, the potato fields were gone, and 17,447 houses stood in their place. 3 other Long Island fortunes, the whale oil, the North Shore marble, the aircraft hangars over Bethpage, were still standing somewhere behind them, in whatever form 30 years or 100 had left them, waiting to be counted. Chapter 9. The Moon Business. The aircraft hangars over Bethpage did not stay quiet for long. The same floor that had turned out Hellcat fighters 2 decades earlier was still running in the early 1960s, only the drawings on the tables had changed shape entirely. On November 7, 1962, NASA awarded Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation a contract worth $387.9 million to design and build the vehicle that would carry American astronauts down to the moon and back. 13 lunar modules would leave that plant over the following decade, every one of them built by hand. Nothing about a lunar module could be built the way a Hellcat had been built. The program alone employed roughly 3,000 engineers and another 7,000 technicians, machinists, and inspectors. 9 or 10,000 people, depending on which department did the counting. Assembly happened inside a clean room. White coats, caps, and gloves changed by the hour, because a single stray thread or a drop tool could compromise a spacecraft with no way to fix it once it launched. Production once stopped for nearly a week over a single piece of chewing gum found on the clean room floor. And 60-hour weeks were the ordinary schedule on the line, not the exception. Every module was tested before anyone trusted it with a crew. Vibration tables, shock rigs, thermal vacuum chambers, each component pushed to a safety margin of 15 to 30% above its expected load, some parts to double that. In September 1967, Grumman sent a full test article, built to the same specification as the third flight module, to NASA's Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, where it spent 4 sessions inside a chamber, simulating an altitude of roughly 150 miles and temperatures down to 300 degrees below zero. Astronaut James Irwin and Grumman's own test pilot Gerald Gibbons sat inside it for the crewed runs in the spring of 1968, finishing in a single week what NASA had scheduled for 2. But no chamber in Bethpage had simulated what came in April of 1970. 200,000 miles from Earth, an oxygen tank ruptured aboard Apollo 13, and the 7th lunar module Grumman had built, Aquarius, designed to keep 2 astronauts alive on the moon for 45 hours, became the only shelter for 3 astronauts for roughly 90 hours, on the way home instead. Its carbon dioxide scrubbers were sized for 2 men over 2 days. After a day and a half with 3 men breathing inside it, the carbon dioxide climbed toward the level NASA's own warning lights were built to catch. Ed Smiley, the engineer running NASA's Crew Systems Division, worked out the fix from the ground. A filter built from plastic bags, cardboard torn from a flight manual, a spacesuit hose, and tape. Tested on Earth, before it was ever described to the crew and assembled by the astronauts in about an hour, power came from 4 silver zinc batteries in the descent stage, and the crew shut down every system not required to stay alive, cutting consumption to roughly a fifth of normal and leaving only a sliver of charge by splashdown. The temperature fell to around 50 degrees Fahrenheit inside the module, colder still in the command module, and water was rationed to about 6 ounces a day. Jim Lovell came home 14 pounds lighter. The crew lost 31.5 pounds among them, and Fred Hayes developed a urinary tract infection from the dehydration. Aquarius itself never came home. Mission rules called for jettisoning the lunar module before the command module's re-entry, and the machine that had kept 3 astronauts alive broke apart in the atmosphere and fell into the ocean. Other Grumman-built modules survived intact, parked in museums or never flown at all. The 13th and last lunar module came off the same clean room floor a few years later, finished on schedule, for a mission NASA had already canceled. It never carried anyone anywhere, and it sits in a museum on Long Island today. The contract that had run Bethpage's biggest line for a decade was ending, with nothing yet lined up to replace it. Chapter 10. The Inventory of What Remains. The plant did not last much longer than the men it saved. Grumman kept building after the Moon. The F-14 Tomcat, the E-2 Hawkeye, the A-6 Intruder, the EA-6B Prowler. And for a while the company grew instead of shrinking. Employment on Long Island climbed through the 1970s and peaked in 1986 at 23,000 workers, the most the Bethpage plant would ever carry at once. For a decade, that looked like proof the company could survive without the Moon. Then the Cold War that had justified all of it simply ended. The Navy canceled NATF, its planned F-14 replacement, in 1991, the same year the A-12 Avenger, meant to replace the A-6 Intruder, collapsed $2.3 billion over budget, and Grumman's proposed Super Tomcat 21 lost the decade's last fighter contract to the F/A-18E/F Super Hornet. Company-wide, employment fell from 33,700 workers in 1987 to 17,900 by January of 1994. And that year, Northrop bought Grumman outright for $2.1 billion, closing the Long Island lines within 2 years and moving what survived to Florida and Louisiana. Down the road in Farmingdale, Republic Aviation, the wartime Thunderbolt builder, had closed in 1987, taking roughly 3,500 jobs with it. Nobody has added up the aerospace jobs Long Island lost across both plants. What Grumman left underground took longer to close than the company itself. A plume of industrial solvent beneath Bethpage, Basi Kavlavus, 4.3 miles by 2.1, moving through the aquifer that once supplied its own workforce with drinking water at a cleanup cost of $406 million over 30 years. By 2026, 97% of the plume was reported under control, though barely 20% of the contamination had actually been removed. A new $46 million plant, drawing 3 million gallons a day through 6 wells, was set to reach full capacity that summer. That spring, contractors drilling beneath the ball fields of Bethpage Community Park, closed since 2002, struck 22 buried drums of industrial waste. The mansions fared little better. Of the 500 to 1,200 houses that rose along the North Shore between the 1890s and 1930, barely a third are still standing. Oheka Castle, Otto Kahn's 127-room house on its own artificial hill, is a hotel now. Its fireproof fireplaces heating wedding receptions instead of house parties for 126 servants. The Vanderbilt estate at Centerport is a museum. The rest came down under the wrecking ball, cleared for the same subdivisions that had already absorbed the potato fields to the south. Sag Harbor, the port that once cleared more tonnage than New York City and then went dark rather than admit whale oil was finished, lists its median home today near $2.8 million. The old Bulova watch case factory is condominiums now, selling for as much as $7 million apiece. Nassau County counted 406,748 residents in 1940, and by 1960 it held 1,300,171, the fastest growing county in the country, and Levittown picked up a name it never quite earned. America's first suburb, when what it was first at was scale, not invention. The barons came back, not the same men but the same order of money, buying back the shoreline the whaling merchants once owned outright. A house from the $7,000 Rouse now costs $750,000. 6 of their descent stages are still standing on the Moon today. 6 of them will still be standing when the next visitor arrives, whenever that turns out to be. 6 of them carry a small manufacturer's plate riveted near the ladder. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, Bethpage, New York. 6 machines built by hands in Bethpage, New York are standing on the Moon tonight, exactly where their pilots stepped off them decades ago. No wind out there weathers the aluminum, and no rain ever reaches the landing struts. 2 weeks of unfiltered sunlight give way to 2 weeks of absolute dark, over and over, with nothing between to soften either one. The plates riveted near each ladder still name Bethpage, New York, bolted to a hillside with no zip code and no distance left to cross. A Long Island machine shop's work is on the moon now. It is the farthest any hometown's craftsmanship has ever traveled from the dirt that grew it.